So once again, this devotional comes during this season that we are in right now in the church called Lent. And Lent is that 40-day period, excluding Sundays, that begins on Ash Wednesday and takes us through Holy Week. It's a time of personal reflection and confession. It is a time where we try to use spiritual disciplines to draw us into God's presence. It's a time for spiritual renewal, for preparation for Holy Week, and understanding the passion of Jesus as he moved towards the cross and then in celebration of the resurrection. But today, for this particular devotional, I want to focus on the first part of what I've talked about Lent being on, and that is this idea of personal reflection and confession. Now look, here's the thing. None of us really like to talk about sin. And in fact, one of the greatest complaints about the church is that we either focus too much on the topic of sin or we don't focus enough on the topic of sin. There's some churches that really talk about sin as their main focus, and there's other churches that just pretend as if sin is not really a thing because they want to focus solely on the grace of God. Somewhere in there is the balance that we need to embrace. And that is because when we think about the concept of sin, essentially what sin is, it's allowing us to let something else come in the way between us and God. It's not something that God is necessarily looking for, but it is something that we often find as a roadblock or a hindrance for us coming into God's presence. You see, sometimes sin is this open, conscious rebellion, and other times it's just something that we get distracted on, and we forget that we are to do the things that God calls us to do. Sometimes sin is based on our human desires versus the way in which God has called us to live. Sometimes our sin is based on misplaced passions, those things that drive us as human beings rather than the things that God really wants to see in our lives. But as I think about this, I think for me personally, one of the most profound, stories about sin and forgiveness is found in a parable that Jesus gives that we now know as the prodigal son. Now, a lot of scholars say that that's a misplaced name, that we shouldn't be calling it the prodigal son, that it's really not so much about the son as it is about the father. But regardless of how you look at it, for me, this is one of the most profound stories about sin and grace that Jesus has ever told or ever tells. Most of us, I think, are familiar with the story of the prodigal son, but essentially what happens in this story is it's a story where the youngest son of two sons rejects his father by demanding his inheritance in advance before his father has passed away. This, of course, creates all kinds of problems. It's all kinds of wrong that this younger son is doing. He then, though, takes those gifts that his father gives him, his inheritance his father gives him, and he goes to a whole other level of disrespect of his father by taking those gifts and squandering them, basically. That's what the story tells us, that he takes his gift into another place in another country, and he squanders all of his great gifts that his father has given him. He lives by his personal passions and loses everything. Well, it's in this moment that the prodigal, the younger son, that he remembers what it was like living in his father's house. And he remembers how people were treated in his father's house. And he begins to come to his own senses when he's hit rock bottom. And he recognizes that he needs to move back towards his father's house. And this is where I think the most profound moment in this whole story happens. So once he comes to his senses, this whole story is found in Luke chapter 15. But once this younger son, the one that becomes known as the prodigal, comes to his senses, this is what happens. In verse 20 it says, "So he sent off and went to his father. And this is the line I love. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion and ran and put his arms around him and he kissed him. You see, this to me is the most profound statement about why we confess and how we receive God's grace. You see, God, like the Father in this story, is not sitting back and looking for those of us who have done things wrong in order to punish us. That father was not looking for his son so that when he came back he could lay down the law again and punish him. No, he's looking for his son so that as soon as he gets a glimpse of his son a far way off, he can come to him on his terms as the father, embrace him and forgive him and bring him back into the relationship he wants. You see, I think sometimes when we think of confession, when we think of how God sees our sin, we think that what God wants to do is punish us. He wants to lay down the law. And that doesn't seem to be what this father in this story is doing. Yes, the prodigal has squandered his gifts. Yes, this prodigal, this younger son, has treated his father terribly. But the will of the Father, the passion of the Father, the desire of the Father is to have that relationship healed, even when we are a long ways off. You know, Paul said in his letter to the Romans, when we were still sinners, God sent his son to us. When we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Not out of a sense of punishment, but in order to allow us to be embraced by the passion and the grace of God. Let this season be a time of confession so that you might receive that grace.